The night Alaska went silent, the temperature fell to -50 degrees Fahrenheit, the power grid collapsed, and Fairbanks began to freeze from the inside out. Pipes burst, smart homes failed. Families who trusted oil furnaces realized too late that heat without electricity is just a promise that can't be kept. But high above the Tanana Valley, on a snow-choked hill, everyone had written off as outdated. One cabin still burned with firelight. Inside, an old man who had built his home for survival, not comfort, made a choice that would decide who lived and who didn't. As desperate knocks echoed through the storm, strangers, children, a newborn, and even the woman who once tried to condemn that cabin crowded around a single stove. Then, on the second night, a figure walked out of the white, an estranged son who hadn't spoken to his father in 15 years, guided only by a memory and a chance at forgiveness. This is a story about what survives when systems fail, old knowledge, open doors, and human courage. Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from, or simply write Amen for everyone fighting their own winter. And if this story moves you, please follow the channel for more stories of survival, redemption, and humanity. Your support truly means a great deal to us. The hill above the Tanana Valley didn't look like much from the highway, just a darker smudge of spruce and birch against a sky that never quite decided whether it was morning or night. Fairbanks in midwinter had that kind of light, a blue-gray glow that made everything feel unfinished, as if the sun itself was rationing effort. But if you followed the plowed road far enough past the last tidy subdivision and the last mailbox decorated with a plastic moose, you'd reach a narrower track that climbed into the trees, and there, perched like a stubborn thought, sat Walter Grady's cabin. Walter had built it in 1970, back when he still believed a man could hammer his own piece into place. He was 78 now, broad-shouldered despite the years, with a chest that still held its old military posture even when his knees complained. His hair had gone iron gray and thin on top, but he kept it clipped short, the way you do when you've spent too long in places where anything loose could get you hurt. A trimmed beard covered his jaw, salt and pepper, rough enough to catch frost on bitter mornings. The lines around his eyes weren't the soft kind that came from laughter. They were the tight, sunken lines of a man who had learned to watch the horizon and not expect it to be kind. Walter didn't talk much in town. When he did, his voice came out steady and economical, like he paid per syllable. He'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, and although he never told stories about it, the war had written itself into him anyway. The habit of waking before dawn, the habit of checking exits without thinking, the habit of preparing for the worst because the worst had once come without warning. People in Fairbanks didn't call him weird. Alaska had room for all types. They called him old-fashioned, outdated. The polite version was traditional. The less polite version was that relic up the hill. And the cabin, in their eyes, matched the man. It wasn't connected to a fiber line. It didn't have a smart thermostat you could adjust from a phone in Hawaii. It didn't have a glowing screen embedded in the refrigerator door. From the outside, it looked like a square-shouldered block of timber with a steep metal roof and a covered porch that faced the valley. Smoke drifted from a black stovepipe, even on days when everyone else's chimneys were quiet. To the modern houses below, heated by oil furnaces that needed electricity to run their fans and pumps, Walter's place looked like an artifact. A museum piece still stubbornly insisting it could be useful. Inside it was warm in a way that felt earned, not the dry uniform heat that came from a vent. This was a living warmth, rising from a wood stove that sat in the main room like a heart. The air smelled faintly of oak and spruce pitch and coffee that had been boiled the same way for decades. The walls were thick, the windows were small, the floorboards creaked with an honesty that made you trust them. Martha Grady moved through that warmth like she belonged to it. She was in her late 70s too, a little shorter than Walter, with a gentle stoop that came from time, not weakness. Her hair was silver and usually pinned back in a loose bun that refused to look neat for long. She had the kind of face that made strangers confess things, soft cheeks, pale skin freckled by age, and eyes the color of weak tea that could turn sharp when the moment required it. Martha wore a quilted robe most mornings, the fabric faded but carefully mended, and slippers that scuffed across the floor with a familiar sound. She hummed hymns without noticing she was doing it, as if a melody was the simplest way to keep the world from feeling too quiet. Walter woke at 5:30, as he always did. The bedroom was cold, not freezing, but cold enough to remind you that outside was serious about killing anything unprepared. He sat up slowly, listening. The cabin made small noises in winter, wood shrinking, metal settling, the faint tick of a stovepipe. No electric hum, no furnace cycling, just the sound of a structure doing what it was built to do. He pulled on wool socks and heavy work pants. Then his flannel shirt, red and dark blue plaid, softened by years of washing. In the main room, the wood stove still held embers from the night before. Walter crouched, opened the iron door, and fed in kindling, then 2 split logs of seasoned birch. His hands were thick and scarred, the fingers slightly knotted but steady. He adjusted the damper the way a musician adjusts an instrument, not guessing, not hoping knowing. Within minutes, the stove began to glow, and warmth pushed outward like something alive. Coffee came next. Walter made it on the stovetop in an old percolator that had outlived presidents. He didn't own a fancy machine, not because he couldn't afford one, but because he didn't trust anything that depended on a button. Buttons failed, batteries died, systems collapsed. He'd seen that happen in jungles and deserts and cities that fell apart overnight. The lesson had lasted. By the time Martha emerged, wrapped in her robe, the cabin's main room had softened into comfort. She paused in the doorway, letting the heat touch her face, and smiled in that quiet, private way couples do when they've survived enough winters together to stop taking warmth for granted. "Cold one," she said, settling into her chair by the window. Walter handed her a mug. "Radio says it's going to get worse." Martha took a sip, then stared out through frost-feathered glass. Below them, the valley lay like a snow-filled bowl, dotted with the lights of Fairbanks. In the dimness, it looked peaceful. A postcard version of Alaska. Smoke from chimneys, a ribbon of road, a handful of buildings that pretended they weren't temporary. "Do we need anything?" she asked. Walter shook his head. "Pantry's full, wood's stacked, oil's topped off." Martha's eyes lingered on the town. "People down there always think the furnace will save them." Walter didn't answer right away. He watched the steam rise from his coffee, watched it curl and vanish. "Oil furnaces are fine," he said finally, "until the power blinks." That was the thing most folks forgot. Fairbanks ran on 2 assumptions: that the grid would keep humming and that the roads would stay open. When both failed, the temperature didn't just drop, it attacked. Cold at this level wasn't weather. It was physics with teeth. Martha turned her mug in her hands, warming her fingers. "You've got that look." "What look?" "The one you get when you already know trouble's coming." Walter's mouth twitched as if he might smile and decided against it. "It's not a look, it's an instinct." He didn't say where it came from. He never did. He just stood, crossed the room, and clicked on the small battery radio that sat on the kitchen counter, an Alaska public safety channel, the kind that didn't waste time with optimism. The announcer's voice crackled through static, tired but urgent. An Arctic outbreak was moving down fast. Temperatures expected to reach dangerous lows. Wind chill potentially life-threatening. Residents advised to prepare for extended outages. Check on neighbors. This is not a drill. Walter turned the volume down and stared at the window. The clouds had a bruised look, heavy, dark-lidded, the kind that made the horizon feel closer. Snow in Alaska didn't always start with a gentle drift. Sometimes it arrived like an invasion. "Supplies," Walter said. Martha nodded, already moving. She didn't argue. That was one of the quiet truths about their marriage. Martha was the soft voice, not the weak one. She'd followed him into this life when everyone else said they were crazy. She'd raised children here, buried a dog here, survived winters that made other people pack up and flee south. She knew preparation wasn't fear. It was respect for the fact that Alaska didn't care about your plans. Walter went first to the covered shed. The woodpile sat stacked in clean rows, birch and spruce, cut and split months ago, bark curling away from dry heartwood. He ran a hand over the ends, checking for dampness. Dry. Good. Enough for weeks, maybe more, as long as it was used with discipline. Next he checked the oil tank gauge. Full enough. Then the hand pump for the well and old metal handle that squeaked when you worked it, drawing cold, clear water from deep below the frost line. Most houses below relied on electric pumps. Walter didn't. His pump required muscle and patience, and Walter still had both. Back inside, Martha moved through their pantry with the calm efficiency of someone who had fed a family through lean years. Canned soups, jars of preserved vegetables, dried beans, flour, salt, things that didn't need a refrigerator or a delivery truck. She checked the first aid kit and lined up extra blankets by the couch without making a comment about why. Walter climbed the ladder to the attic last. He pushed aside insulation and crawled into the space that most people didn't know existed unless you pointed it out. Above him was the outer roof metal and timber built to take the punishment of snow load and wind. Below him was the inner roof tight sealed planks that held warmth in like a fist. Between them, an 18-inch pocket of dead air. Walter touched the underside of the inner roof and felt faint heat rising. The gap itself was cold, but not cruel. It did exactly what his father had taught him it would do. His father's name was Einar Grady, a Norwegian immigrant who had arrived in Alaska with nothing but a toolbox and an accent sharp enough to cut fish. Einar had believed winter wasn't scenery. It was an enemy. "Air that cannot move cannot steal your heat," he used to say, tapping a knuckle on a beam. "The best insulator is nothing if you trap it right." Walter had built this cabin with that lesson hammered into every joint. Downstairs, Martha called up softly. "Walter?" He crawled back toward the ladder. "Yeah." "The phone rang yesterday," she said when he came down. "A number from Chicago." Walter stopped. For a half-second, the only sound was the stove's low crackle. Martha held his gaze. "It was Evan. He didn't leave a message. Just called." Walter's jaw tightened, not with anger exactly, more like old pain being stirred. Evan, their eldest, the one who'd left Fairbanks 15 years ago and made a life that seemed designed to prove he didn't need them. Chicago job, Chicago friends, Chicago opinions about how people should live. For years, Walter had waited for the calls to become regular again. They hadn't. The silence had settled like frost, slow and persistent. "What did you do?" Walter asked. "I let it ring," Martha admitted, voice gentle. "Then I listened to the voicemail box. There wasn't anything." Walter looked back toward the window, toward the bruised sky over the Tanana Valley. "Storm'll hit Chicago too," he said, as if that was the only safe thing to say. Martha stepped closer and rested her hand on his forearm. Her fingers were small but steady. "Sometimes people call when they're scared," she murmured, "not when they're brave." Walter didn't answer. He stared into the firelight as if it might show him what to do with a son shaped by distance and pride. Outside, the wind began to rise, testing the cabin's corners. The radio's warning replayed in his mind. Check on neighbors. Prepare. Extended outages. Walter inhaled slowly, then exhaled with the deliberation of a man choosing a hard path because it was the only honest one. He looked at Martha, and something unspoken passed between them. 54 years of marriage distilled into a single glance. "We'll keep the porch lamp on," he said. Martha's eyes softened. "For who?" Walter's gaze shifted to the valley, to the scattered lights below, to the town that trusted its systems like they were guarantees. Then back to the dark line of road that led up to their hill. "For anyone," he said, "who remembers where the warm place is." Outside, the first hard snow began to fall, thick flakes that didn't drift so much as arrive with purpose. The Tanana Valley dimmed under a whitening veil. Walter added another log to the stove, adjusted the damper, and listened to the cabin answer with steady heat. He didn't know who would come up that hill when the grid finally blinked out. He didn't know if Evan would call again or if a call was all he'd ever get. But he knew one thing with the clarity that comes when you've lived long enough to see patterns repeat. In Alaska, the cold didn't care about your pride. It only cared whether you were ready. And Walter Grady had been ready for a long time. 2:47 a.m. arrived without ceremony. No thunder, no dramatic flash, just a sudden, unnatural quiet. In Fairbanks, silence like that meant only one thing. The grid had gone dark. Walter Grady felt it before he heard it. The faint hum that lived beneath modern life, the distant buzz of transformers, the whisper of electric lines carrying heat into houses, vanished as if someone had cut the breath from the valley. The radio on the counter clicked once and fell silent. Outside, the wind rose, not louder, but sharper, slicing through the spruce like a blade drawn slow and deliberate. Down in town, oil furnaces still had fuel in their tanks, but without electricity to drive the blowers and pumps, they were nothing more than cold metal boxes. Heat fled rooms the way water finds cracks. Walls began to pop as moisture froze inside them, a sound like knuckles snapping. Pipes surrendered next, bursting with a dull violence that echoed through empty kitchens and basements. Thermostats glowed uselessly until their backup batteries died, leaving houses blind and numb. On the hill, Walter's cabin did not notice the blackout the same way. The wood stove breathed steadily, its iron belly radiating warmth earned by split logs and time. The dead air gap above the ceiling trapped heat like a held secret. The cabin creaked, but it did not panic. Martha woke to the change in sound. She sat up listening, her silver hair loose against her shoulders, eyes already alert. "It's out," she said quietly. Walter was already on his feet, pulling on boots. "Yeah." He checked the stove, adjusted the damper a fraction, then glanced at the thermometer nailed beside the door. Inside, 68 degrees. Comfortable. Outside, dropping fast. He knew the numbers by heart. At 50 below, exposed skin burned in minutes, lungs ached, engines failed. People made mistakes because their brains slowed, betrayed by cold. Martha wrapped herself in a heavy sweater and moved to the kitchen, lighting an oil lamp. Its flame wavered, then steadied. She set a kettle on the stove not because they needed tea, but because routine calmed the mind. Walter opened the porch door just long enough to feel the wind hit him like a wall. The cold was immediate, aggressive, pressing into his beard, biting the edges of his ears. He shut the door again and latched it tight. The first knock came less than an hour later. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a pounding, uneven and desperate, followed by a voice cracked raw by cold. Walter didn't hesitate. He lifted the latch and pulled the door open against the wind. Scott Miller stumbled inside with the force of someone who had been leaning against hope. He was in his early 40s, tall and lean with a runner's build gone soft at the edges. His dark hair was matted with ice, eyelashes clumped white, cheeks burned a violent red. He wore a city parka that looked thick but had betrayed him anyway. Behind him came 3 children in various states of shock. Lily, 12, tried to look brave, her freckled face pale beneath a knitted hat pulled too low. Noah, 9, shivered uncontrollably, his lips trembling. Ben, 5, clung to his father's leg, too cold to cry, his small nose running clear and bright. "Power went out," Scott gasped. "Car wouldn't start. He didn't finish. Walter shut the door, cutting off the wind, and guided them toward the stove. "Boots off," Walter said, not unkindly. "Get them dry." Martha was already there, wrapping blankets around the children, her hands brisk and practiced. She crouched to Ben's level, smiling softly, murmuring words that meant safety, even if he couldn't process them yet. Scott stood there, chest heaving, guilt and relief fighting on his face. "You did the right thing," Martha told him. Scott nodded, swallowing hard. "I remembered the light," he said, "on the hill." Walter glanced at the porch lamp glowing steady through the frost on the window. He said nothing. They had just begun to thaw when headlights appeared through the trees, cutting pale lines in the snow. Another knock followed, quicker, more frantic. Kyle Harper burst in first, stocky and broad-shouldered, his beard thick and frozen into stiff white spikes. His eyes darted like a cornered animal's. Behind him, Jenna Harper moved carefully, her slender frame hunched around a bundle held tight to her chest. Jenna was tall and narrow-hipped, with dark blonde hair plastered to her cheeks and skin gone sallow with fear. The bundle whimpered. A newborn girl, Maisie, no more than a few weeks old, her tiny lips tinged blue. "Our furnace," Kyle started, then stopped when he saw the baby's color reflected in Walter's eyes. "Stove," Walter said sharply. "Now." They moved as one. Martha took Maisie with a gentleness that belied the urgency, peeling back layers, checking fingers and toes. The baby's skin was cold to the touch, her breathing shallow. Jenna stood rigid, shaking, whispering apologies to a child who couldn't understand words yet. "She'll warm," Martha said, voice firm. "But we don't waste time." The cabin filled with new sounds, crying, whispered prayers, the scrape of chairs pulled closer to heat. Outside the wind roared louder, as if offended by resistance. The next arrival came on foot. Hank Dolan didn't knock so much as test the door, cautious even in desperation. He was in his late 60s, thick through the shoulders, with a face carved into permanent lines by years of squinting into snow glare. A gray mustache covered his upper lip, yellowed at the edges by old tobacco. He wore a battered parka with an Alaska State Trooper's patch long faded, and cradled in his arms was a dog. Buddy was old 12, maybe 13, his muzzle white, his ears drooping. One hind leg dragged slightly, stiff with age and cold. His eyes, however, were clear and watchful. "They wouldn't take him," Hank said simply, nodding toward the valley. "Shelter." Walter stepped aside. "Then he stays." Buddy gave a low huff of gratitude and limped toward the stove, collapsing with a sigh that seemed to come from his bones. Hank's shoulders sagged a fraction, the tension easing now that the dog was safe. By dawn, the cabin held more people than it was built for, but it held. The stove worked harder. Walter rationed logs, adjusting airflow with precision. No one complained. They watched the thermometer drop outside, numbers turning obscene. Late morning brought the knock no one expected, and everyone feared. Mayor Allison Price stood on the porch, her gloved hand raised, her confidence stripped bare by the cold. She was in her early 50s, tall and straight-backed even now, with sharp cheekbones and carefully cut chestnut hair that escaped her hood in frozen strands. Her coat was expensive, tailored for meetings and press conferences, not survival. Mascara had smudged beneath her eyes, and her lips were cracked despite expensive balm. She looked smaller than she did on posters. Walter opened the door and stepped back. He didn't greet her. He didn't smile. He simply made space. Allison hesitated, pride warring with the undeniable math of exposure. Then she crossed the threshold, shoulders shaking, breath hitching as warmth hit her like a confession. "I'm sorry," she said, too fast, words tumbling out before she could arrange them into something political. We thought—" Walter closed the door. In Alaska, no one lectures the cold. You survive it or you don't. Allison sank onto a chair, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. The day wore on in a blur of small crises. Water was drawn from the hand pump, cold but liquid. Soup simmered on the stove. Children slept in shifts, bodies packed close. Buddy's breathing evened out, his head resting on Hank's boot. The cabin smelled of wet wool and wood smoke and human fear slowly giving way to trust. Outside, Fairbanks disappeared into a white roar. Roads vanished. Engines froze solid. The radio crackled back to life briefly, voices strained and overlapping, then died again. As night fell, if it could be called night when the sky never fully brightened, Walter counted heads. 23 souls. Too many. And still the porch lamp burned. Near midnight, a sound cut through the wind that wasn't a knock. It was a thud. Heavy, dull, followed by another, like a body striking wood. Walter was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand more out of habit than intent. He moved to the door, heart pounding, listening. Another impact, weaker this time. A muffled sound, maybe a voice, maybe just breath torn by cold. Martha's eyes met his. She nodded once. Walter unlatched the door. The wind surged in, carrying snow and darkness and something else, something human, collapsing across the threshold as the world outside tried one more time to claim its due. Day 2 did not bring relief. If anything, Alaska leaned harder into its cruelty, as if offended that anyone had slept at all. The wind sharpened overnight, no longer howling but slicing, driving snow sideways in dense, blinding sheets. The sky pressed low and colorless over the Tanana Valley, erasing distance, erasing time. Inside the cabin, more than 20 people breathed the same air, bound together by heat, discipline, and the unspoken agreement that survival required obedience to routine. Walter Grady ran the place the way he once ran patrols. Calm, firm, efficient. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. People responded to the certainty in his movements, the way he adjusted the stove without glancing at it, the way he counted minutes and bodies without writing anything down. He assigned shifts 2 at a time to feed the fire, 1 to draw water from the hand pump, 1 to check on the children. No one argued. The cold outside made rebellion feel childish. Martha became the cabin's quiet center. She moved among people with a shawl over her shoulders, offering soup, straightening blankets, pressing a warm palm to foreheads. Her face showed the strain now, fine lines deepening, her lips thinning when she thought no one was watching, but her voice stayed gentle. She hummed hymns again, not loudly, just enough to remind people that sound could still be human. By mid-morning, the thermometer nailed by the door read -52. The cabin held at 60, but Walter knew that margin was a fragile thing. Wood was life. Air leaks were death. He sealed one window with extra canvas when he felt a draft, his hands sure despite the cold seeping through the walls. It was near noon when the sound came. Not a knock, not even a thump the way Scott Miller had arrived. This was a dull, uneven impact, followed by the slow scrape of something sliding down the door. Walter felt it in his chest before his mind caught up. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled the latch. The wind surged inside like an animal, carrying snow and darkness and a man. The figure collapsed across the threshold, half in, half out, heavy and unresisting. Walter grabbed him under the arms and dragged him fully inside before slamming the door shut. Snow scattered across the floor. For a second, no one moved. Then Martha knelt. "Walter," she whispered, her voice breaking. The man on the floor looked nothing like the son she remembered leaving 15 years ago. Evan Grady had once been broad-faced and clean-cut, a Fairbanks boy with a quick smile and impatient energy. Now his beard was thick and wild, frozen solid in clumps along his jaw, his hair matted beneath a hood rimmed with ice. His skin was gray beneath the red burn of frostbite, lips cracked and bleeding. His eyelashes were white with frost, eyes barely open, unfocused, reflecting the stove's glow like broken glass. He smelled of cold and exhaustion and something else, fear, long carried. Walter knelt too, his hand steady even as something twisted behind his ribs. He pressed fingers to Evan's neck, counting. Weak, fast, alive. "Blankets," he said. "Now." Martha and Jenna moved at once, layering wool and fleece. Kyle hovered uselessly, guilt written all over his face for being warm while another man froze. Hank Dolan stood back, jaw tight, one hand resting unconsciously on Buddy's head. The dog watched everything, ears drooping, eyes alert. They stripped Evan's outer layers carefully. His coat was useless indeed thin insulation, city-made, soaked with sweat and snow. His boots were stiff with ice. When Walter peeled off a glove, Evan's fingers were waxy white, then mottled blue. "How long?" Ray Park asked quietly from the edge of the room. Ray was in his early 70s, small and compact, with wire-rimmed glasses fogged by heat. His hands were surgeon-steady, his expression calm in a way that only came from decades of measuring emergencies. Walter met his eyes. Too long. Evan stirred as warmth reached him, a low sound escaping his throat, not quite a word, not quite a groan. His eyes fluttered, then focused briefly on Walter's face. "Dad," he rasped. The word hit the room like a dropped plate. Walter swallowed. He had imagined this moment too many times. Angry, accusatory, triumphant, indifferent. None of those fit. All he felt was a hard, aching relief. "Don't talk," Walter said. "Save it." Evan's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "You kept the light on." Walter didn't answer. He squeezed Evan's shoulder once, then stood. He trusted Martha with the rest. It took hours to stabilize him. Warmth returned slowly, painfully. Ray monitored breathing, pulse, signs of frostbite damage. Evan drifted in and out, murmuring fragments, roads disappearing, the car dying, the cold so loud it felt alive. At one point he gripped Martha's sleeve with surprising strength. "I remembered," he whispered. "What you said, about the hill." Martha bent close, tears bright in her eyes. "You came home," she said. "That's all that matters." When Evan finally slept, his breathing deep and even, the cabin exhaled. People returned to their quiet routines, but something had shifted. The storm outside no longer felt like the only enemy. Time had entered the room. Walter stood by the window, staring out at the white nothingness beyond the glass. 15 years collapsed into a single image. Evan at 23, suitcase in hand, eyes hard with ambition. Words exchanged then that couldn't be taken back. Walter had taught his son everything about survival, except how to leave without severing something vital. "Is he—" Allison Price approached him, her voice stripped of its usual authority. She looked smaller today, shoulders hunched, hair escaping its clip in dull strands. There was no makeup now, no shield. "He'll live," Walter said, "if the cold didn't take him already." Allison nodded, shame and gratitude crossing her face in quick succession. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "About the hill, about this place." Walter's gaze stayed on the valley. Most people don't, until they need it. The afternoon dragged on. The wind did not let up. Snow piled against the cabin's north wall, insulating it further, but also sealing it in. Wood dwindled faster now with more bodies, more moisture in the air. Walter adjusted the damper again, careful not to starve the fire or waste heat. As dusk, or something like it, settled, Evan woke again. This time his eyes were clearer, his voice steadier, though still rough. "I walked 30 miles, he said to no one in particular. "Car died near the river. I thought I was done." Walter sat across from him, hands wrapped around a mug he wasn't drinking. "Why didn't you turn back?" Evan looked at him then, really looked. His eyes were red-rimmed, bloodshot, but honest in a way they hadn't been for years. "Because the only place I knew that wasn't pretending was here." The words landed heavy, unfinished. Before Walter could answer, a sharp cry cut through the room. It was a child's cough, high, wet, wrong. Rosa Alvarez stood frozen near the stove, her dark hair pulled back in a loose braid, her face tight with fear. In her arms, her 4-year-old daughter Eva coughed again, small chest heaving, eyes glassy. Miguel Alvarez hovered behind them, broad and strong but helpless now, his hands clenched at his sides. Ray was already moving, kneeling to listen, his brow furrowing. The cough echoed again, deeper this time, and the room seemed to shrink around it. Walter felt the shift immediately. The storm was no longer just outside. It had found a new way in. Outside, the wind screamed against the walls. Inside, the fire crackled lower than it had an hour ago. Walter glanced at the woodpile, then at his son, still wrapped in blankets, newly returned to a world that might ask something terrible of him. The cold had not finished taking its toll. Day 3 broke without light. In Alaska's deep winter, morning was more a concept than a condition, a subtle thinning of darkness that fooled no one. The storm had not moved on. It had settled in, grinding the world down to white noise and cold math. Inside the cabin, breath fogged the air despite the fire, and every sound felt sharper, edged with consequence. Eva Alvarez's cough worsened before dawn. It was no longer just a cough. It came from deep in her chest, wet and rattling, the kind that made adults stop what they were doing and exchange looks they didn't want children to see. Rosa Alvarez held her daughter tight, rocking back and forth near the stove, whispering in Spanish through clenched teeth. Rosa was small and wiry, her dark hair braided down her back, her skin olive-toned but ashen now with fear. She had the look of a woman who had crossed borders before and learned how quickly safety could evaporate. Miguel stood behind her, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, his beard untrimmed and flecked with gray. He was a man built for labor, not helpless waiting, and his hands kept opening and closing as if searching for something solid to grip. Dr. Ray Park listened with his stethoscope, his brow creasing deeper with every breath Eva took. Ray had the posture of a man who conserved motion, compact, slightly stooped, his thinning hair neatly combed, wire-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose. He had spent decades behind pharmacy counters and in back rooms where people brought their quiet emergencies when hospitals felt too far away. He straightened slowly and met Walter's eyes. "Pneumonia," Ray said, "or headed there fast." Rosa froze. "She needs hospital?" Ray shook his head once. "She needs antibiotics. Soon." The word hung in the air like frost. Walter didn't ask where to find them. He already knew the answer. Fairbanks Memorial Hospital was dark. The clinics were frozen shut. Roads had vanished beneath drifts that swallowed vehicles whole. In Alaska, distance was measured in hours when conditions were good and in lives when they weren't. "How long?" Miguel asked. Ray hesitated, then chose honesty. "We're counting hours, not days." Silence spread through the cabin, broken only by the fire's crackle and Eva's labored breathing. Children sensed the shift and grew quiet. Buddy lifted his head, ears twitching, then laid it back down, eyes following Walter. "I'll go," Evan said. The words came out rough, unpolished, but certain. Evan sat up straighter on the couch, color still poor in his face, dark circles carved beneath his eyes. The frostbite on his fingers had begun to fade from white to angry red, a painful sign of returning blood flow. He looked older than his 53 years, his beard streaked with gray, his features sharpened by hardship. Whatever arrogance had once driven him away from this hill had been scoured down by 30 miles of walking through hell. Walter turned slowly. "You're barely back on your feet." Evan held his gaze. "I can walk, I can follow a bearing, and I owe this place more than sleep." Before Walter could answer, Allison Price stepped forward. "I'm going too," she said. Heads turned. The former mayor stood stiffly, her coat cinched tight, her posture betraying the fact that she was used to control and had lost it. Allison was tall, her frame lean rather than fragile, but the cold had etched itself into her features. Her hair, once carefully styled, was pulled into a practical knot, loose strands frozen against her temples. There was no trace of the polished authority she wore in council chambers. What remained was a woman with bloodshot eyes and a jaw set against fear. "I know the service roads," she added, "the maintenance routes, and if this goes wrong, it should be on me." Walter studied her for a long moment. He saw what she didn't say, the memory of denying permits, of calling his cabin an obstacle to progress. He also saw something newer, harder to dismiss resolve, stripped of ego. "You slow us down," Walter said flatly. "I'll keep up," Allison replied. "Or I'll tell you to leave me." Walter nodded once. Decision made. Preparation was swift and brutal. Walter laid out gear on the table as if it were a map room. Layered clothing, wool base, insulated mid-layers, wind-proof shells, neoprene face masks to guard against frostbite, goggles to keep snow blindness at bay. He handed Evan a compass, old and scarred, and pointed to a penciled line on a weathered topographic map tacked to the wall. "Stay in the trees," Walter said. Avoid open ground. Wind'll skin you alive. He gave Allison a trekking pole and showed her how to test drifts before stepping. He checked their packs himself. Water insulated against freezing, emergency rations, flares, a small first aid kit. Last he handed Evan a handheld radio, its batteries wrapped in tape to keep them warm. "If you miss the check-in," Walter said, "we assume you're dead and act accordingly." Evan swallowed, then nodded. "Understood." Martha stood nearby, hands clasped tight, her face pale but composed. She pressed a scarf into Evan's hands, one she had knitted years ago. "Bring yourself back," she said simply. They left just after midday, when the light, such as it was, offered the best chance of navigation. The door closed behind them with a finality that made the cabin feel suddenly smaller. Hours crawled by. Inside, time stretched and warped. The fire burned lower. Walter rationed wood further, banking coals, keeping heat where bodies clustered. Ray tended Eva, counting breaths, wiping sweat from her brow. Rosa did not move from her side. Miguel paced until Hank Dolan quietly blocked his path, a silent warning that anxiety wasted warmth. Outside, Evan and Allison disappeared into the white. They moved in silence, breath loud inside their masks. The cold was a physical presence, pressing against them, seeping through layers, numbing thought. Evan set the pace, steady and relentless, his body remembering what his mind tried to forget. Allison followed, her movements efficient but tense, every step a negotiation with ice and fear. They reached the edge of town by mid-afternoon. Fairbanks looked abandoned, a frozen set piece. Cars sat half-buried, doors open where people had fled. The clinic door was locked, its windows opaque with frost. Evan forced it anyway. Inside, shelves stood bare where emergency supplies had already been stripped away. Allison cursed softly, frustration cracking her composure. They found the antibiotics in a back storage room, buried behind outdated inventory. Ray's instructions echoed in Evan's head as he checked labels, dosage, expiration dates. He stuffed the box into his pack with shaking hands. The return was worse. The wind shifted, erasing their tracks. Allison slipped on black ice hidden beneath powder and went down hard. Pain shot up her leg, sharp and immediate. She bit back a scream, teeth grinding. "Can you stand?" Evan asked. "Yes," she lied, then tried and failed. Evan hauled her up anyway, half carrying her now, her weight dragging at his injured strength. Minutes stretched into hours. The radio crackled once, then went dead. Darkness thickened. The trees blurred into shadows. It was near dusk when they saw the truck. It sat angled across a service road, hazard lights dead, its hood rimmed with ice. A man stood beside it, tall and broad, his reflective jacket dulled by snow. He turned at the sound of their approach, relief and caution warring on his face. Caleb Rourke was in his early 40s, with a lineman's build, thick forearms, square jaw, a beard grown wild under weeks of cold-weather work. His eyes were bloodshot but sharp. He looked like a man who trusted tools more than promises. "Power company," he said. "Lines are down everywhere. I've been out here 2 days." They took him back with them, slower now, heavier, the cold gnawing at Evan's resolve. By the time the cabin's porch light cut through the storm, Evan's vision tunneled, his legs trembling with exhaustion. Inside, the reaction was immediate and wordless. Hands grabbed packs. Martha cried out when she saw Evan's face. Ray tore into the box of medicine like a lifeline. Allison collapsed into a chair, her ankle already swelling, her face twisted with pain and something like relief. Caleb leaned against the wall, staring at the fire as if it were a miracle. "They're looking for you," Caleb said hoarsely, once he'd caught his breath. "National Guard. Folks on the emergency channel keep talking about a cabin with smoke still rising." Walter met his eyes. "Then they'd better hurry." Ray administered the first dose to Eva. Her breathing eased just slightly, enough to send Rosa sobbing into Miguel's chest. The cabin exhaled as one, but Walter's gaze drifted to the woodpile again, to the shrinking stacks, to the wind that showed no sign of mercy. Rescue was a rumor, not a guarantee, and Alaska had a way of demanding payment before it granted reprieve. Outside, the storm pressed closer, as if aware it was losing ground and intent on reclaiming it. Day 4 arrived without ceremony. No sunrise, no easing of the wind, no signal that the world intended to be kinder. Alaska did not announce mercy in advance. It tested first, then decided. Walter Grady stood by the woodpile before dawn, counting with his eyes rather than his hands. The stacks that had once looked reassuring now appeared thin, uneven, their gaps too visible. He did the math quickly, the way men who had spent their lives rationing did it, quietly, without drama. At the current burn rate, they had maybe a day. 2 if he strangled the fire down to embers and let the cabin cool. He went back inside and closed the stove damper by a fraction. The fire responded immediately, shrinking, sulking, its warmth retreating toward itself. The cabin noticed. People pulled blankets tighter. Children pressed closer to parents. Condensation formed on the windows and froze in fern-like patterns. Breath fog thickened. No one complained. By now they understood the rules. Heat was currency, noise was waste, panic was fatal. Walter spoke once, clearly so everyone could hear. From now on we live close. No corners. Body heat matters. No one argued. They rearranged themselves instinctively, a slow migration toward the stove. Hank Dolan sat with his back against the hearth. Buddy the dog curled against his legs, the old animal's gray muzzle resting on his boot. Buddy was 12, maybe older, his hips stiff, his coat thick but thinning in places. He had the patient eyes of a creature who had learned that pain was temporary, but companionship was survival. Rosa Alvarez lay on the floor beside Eva, her arm wrapped protectively around the child. Eva's breathing was still rough but steadier now, the antibiotics beginning to work their quiet miracle. Ray Park checked her every hour, methodical, unflinching. His face showed strain, but his hands remained precise. For a man who had spent his life measuring doses and outcomes, this was the purest form of medicine presence, vigilance, time. Evan sat with his back against the wall, knees drawn up, conserving strength. The color had returned to his fingers, but pain still flickered there, a reminder of how close he'd come to losing them. He watched his father without speaking, seeing now what he hadn't before. Not stubbornness, not isolation, but a lifetime of preparation for moments exactly like this. Martha noticed the cold before anyone said it out loud. She always did. She rose slowly from her chair, joints stiff, and crossed the cabin with deliberate care. In the far corner stood the upright piano, its wood scarred, its keys yellowed with age. It had been hauled up the hill decades ago, piece by piece, more sentiment than practicality. She sat. Her hands hovered for a moment, fingers trembling, not from cold, but from memory. Then she began to play. The piano was badly out of tune. Several keys stuck. The sound wavered, imperfect and fragile, but the melody was unmistakable. Amazing Grace. At first, people just listened. Then someone, no one could say who, began to hum. A low, uncertain harmony. Then words followed, tentative at first, then stronger. 30 voices, different accents, different histories rose together. Children sang without knowing all the words. Adults sang with eyes closed. Even Evan's voice joined, rough and unused, catching in his throat. Walter stood near the stove, not singing, just listening. He felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been tight for days. The cold still pressed in. The fire still burned low. But the cabin felt warmer, somehow fuller. When the song ended, silence held for a beat longer than necessary. Then Martha pressed another key, softer this time, and the cabin breathed again. That night, the temperature inside dropped to 58 degrees. No one slept much. They shifted positions, shared blankets, took turns feeding the fire just enough to keep it alive. Walter woke every hour, checking the stove, checking faces, counting breaths. He had not slept through a night in years. He did not expect to start now. By day 5, the woodpile was down to its last third. The wind finally began to ease, not dramatically, but enough that the howling softened into a distant, constant moan. Outside, the world remained lethal, but the storm had lost its rage. The radio crackled intermittently, with updates, partial grid restoration in lowland Fairbanks, emergency crews mobilizing, National Guard units expanding search zones. Still no vehicles on the hill. Caleb Rourke stood by the window, peering out through frost-rimmed glass. He was bundled in borrowed layers now, his electrician's jacket hanging loose over them. "If they're coming," he said quietly, "it'll be soon. The weather's finally letting them move." Walter nodded, but said nothing. He had learned long ago not to trust hope until it walked through the door. That afternoon they burned furniture. An old dresser first, solid wood, dry enough to catch. The flames were dirtier, smokier, but they threw heat. No one objected. Objects were replaceable, people were not. As evening fell, the sound came, not the wind, not the stove. Engines. At first, it was faint, almost imagined, then unmistakable. A deep mechanical rumble, steady and deliberate, cutting through the cold. Walter was at the door before anyone else moved. Headlights appeared through the trees, bouncing, growing brighter. 2 National Guard vehicles crested the rise, followed by a utility truck. Snow churned beneath their tires. Men and women in heavy gear disembarked, faces red, eyes sharp. The lead officer stepped forward. He was in his early 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, with a trimmed beard already dusted with frost. His posture was alert but respectful. "Walter Grady?" he asked. "That's me. Captain Aaron Whitaker, Alaska National Guard." He glanced past Walter, taking in the crowded cabin, the low fire, the exhaustion etched into every face. His expression shifted, something like awe breaking through professionalism. "We've been hearing about this place for 2 days. We followed a lineman's report." Caleb let out a breath he'd been holding and managed a tired smile. Within minutes, the cabin filled with movement. Supplies were unloaded: fuel, food, medical equipment. The utility crew got to work on the line that served the hill. When the power surged back on, a single lamp flickered to life, and someone laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. People cried openly then. The evacuation took hours. Families were escorted down the hill, some to intact homes, others to shelters. Hugs were exchanged, names promised to be remembered. Rosa kissed Martha's hands. Miguel clasped Walter's shoulder with both of his, unable to speak. Hank left last with Buddy, the dog lifting his head at the cold air, tail wagging weakly. When the cabin finally emptied, silence returned, but it was different now. Not hollow. Settled. Mayor Allison Price lingered on the porch, her ankle wrapped, her face pale but resolute. "I owe you more than an apology," she said. "I intend to make this right." She outlined her plan quickly, almost urgently. The Grady Arctic Resilience Center, workshops, training, a place where old knowledge would be taught before it was needed again. Walter listened, hands in his pockets, eyes on the valley below. "If you do it," he said, "do it honestly. No branding, no politics." Allison nodded. "Agreed." Evan stepped forward as the last vehicle prepared to leave. "I'm not going," he said. Walter turned, surprised. "I'm staying," Evan continued. "If you'll have me. I need to learn what I forgot." Walter looked at his son for a long moment. Then he nodded. "We'll start with chopping wood." When the engines faded and the hill grew quiet again, Walter stood alone on the porch. The Tanana Valley stretched below, scarred but breathing. He understood now, with a clarity earned over decades, that survival was not about strength or technology or even preparation alone. It was about knowledge passed down, doors opened, and people choosing again and again not to turn away.